The airport was busy, as it always was. Travelers hurriedly moved from one gate to another, while the sound of announcements echoed through the terminal. Among the crowd was a woman, walking with the confidence of someone used to the hustle and bustle of international travel. She was dressed professionally, with a neat blazer and a calm expression on her face. Her steps were steady, but there was something different about this trip, something that made this journey far more important than the others. She had just completed a significant diplomatic mission in a foreign country for the United Nations. Now she was heading back home, bringing with her not just the weight of the work she'd done, but the knowledge that her efforts had made a difference. The woman had worked hard for this opportunity. She was proud of the accomplishments she'd made for her country and the people she represented. Her diplomatic credentials were impeccable, and she carried them with a sense of honor. As she approached the customs counter, she could see that the officer behind the desk was busy with paperwork. He barely glanced at her when she walked up, but she didn't mind. It was just another part of the routine. She handed him her passport, ready to go through the usual checks. But something about the way he took the passport caught her attention. He examined it with more focus than usual, flipping through the pages slowly, his brow furrowing as he did so. The woman could sense that something was wrong. She'd traveled enough to recognize the look of doubt in someone's eyes, and this officer was clearly uneasy. She stood still, trying to keep her composure. But inside, she couldn't help but feel a spark of concern. The officer raised his eyes and looked at her, then back at the passport. "This passport doesn't seem right," he said with a frown, his voice carrying an air of uncertainty. The woman's stomach tightened. She had traveled with this passport countless times, and it had never been questioned before. What was going on? She tried to remain calm, offering him a polite smile. "I assure you, everything is in order. This is my official passport. I am a diplomat with the United Nations." But the officer wasn't convinced. He glanced at her again, his eyes narrow with suspicion. "It doesn't look like a real passport," he muttered, more to himself than to her. He then handed it over to another officer nearby. The two exchanged a few words, both now examining the passport in detail. The woman's heart began to race, but she refused to show it. She dealt with difficult situations before, whether on the job as a diplomat or in other parts of her life. She knew the importance of keeping a level head, no matter what was thrown at her. Still, there was a sense of unease creeping in. She had no idea why they were questioning her passport, but something told her this wasn't going to be as simple as a routine check. As the officers exchanged murmurs, the woman thought back to the mission she had just completed. She had been representing the United Nations in meetings with government officials from a foreign country. She had been part of important negotiations, working to bridge gaps between conflicting parties. This wasn't just any trip. It was a mission with real, lasting impacts. And now, at the airport, it seemed like something out of her control might derail everything. The seconds ticked by like hours, each one filled with the growing realization that this was not going to be as easy as showing her credentials and walking away. Something wasn't right, and she had no idea how far it would go. Would they let her go? Or would this become more complicated than she could have imagined? The officer continued to hold the passport in his hands, flipping through the pages with increasing concern. The woman remained calm, though a sense of confusion began to cloud her thoughts. Why were they acting like this? Her passport was legitimate, and she had traveled many times with it without any issues. Her travels as a diplomat had always gone smoothly, and this situation seemed out of place. She watched as the officer's eyes darted between the passport and his computer screen. He typed something quickly, his fingers moving across the keyboard with rapid precision. The sound of his keystrokes echoed through the stillness, making the waiting feel longer than it really was. The woman's patience began to wear thin, but she remained silent. There was nothing more she could do than wait for them to finish their checks. But the officer's expression didn't ease. Instead, his frown deepened, and he glanced up at her again. "I'm sorry, but I'll need to get a second opinion," he said. His voice lacked the reassuring tone that might come with a routine check, and she could feel the tension in his words. This wasn't just a simple misunderstanding anymore. A second officer, slightly older, approached and peered at the passport over the first officer's shoulder. Their conversation was low, but the words she overheard made her stomach tighten. "This doesn't look right," the second officer muttered, pointing to a detail in the passport. "The hologram's off, and the security features aren't matching what we have on file. It's not consistent with what we're used to seeing." The words hit her like a punch. What did they mean by that? She had never once doubted the authenticity of her passport, and yet they were acting as if it was some kind of fraud. The second officer turned his attention to her. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his tone now shifting from neutral to suspicious. The woman felt a knot form in her throat. She could tell that this wasn't going to end as easily as she had hoped. The officers weren't just doubting the passport. They were now questioning her. She repeated, as calmly as she could, "I'm a United Nations diplomat. This is my official diplomatic passport. I have been traveling under these credentials for years. Please, check with your superiors if needed." But her words didn't seem to have the desired effect. Instead of being reassured, the officers exchanged looks that only added to her growing sense of unease. The second officer raised an eyebrow and shook his head. "That's not enough," he said firmly. "We need to verify this. But diplomat or not, this passport needs to be checked thoroughly." Her patience was beginning to fray, but she kept her voice steady. "This is a mistake," she insisted. "I'm telling you, it's genuine." But they were not listening. The first officer walked off to make a phone call, leaving the woman standing there, trying to remain composed. Her thoughts raced, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the situation was about to spiral out of control. She knew her rights, and she knew that something wasn't right about how they were handling this. But even as she stood there, she couldn't help but wonder what more they were going to do. Would they go as far as to hold her up longer? Could this turn into something more serious than a simple misunderstanding? The seconds seemed to stretch endlessly. The busy terminal around her seemed to blur, as her mind focused solely on the officers and the uncertain outcome of this situation. She had hoped this would be just another routine stop, another simple check at the airport. Instead, she was now caught in an uncomfortable limbo, wondering when, if, this would ever end. The woman stood in silence, trying her best to remain composed, but the situation was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. The officers had moved away, leaving her standing alone at the customs counter, the hustle and bustle of the airport continuing around her. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, each second stretching into what felt like eternity. It was as if the entire airport had become a distant blur, and all that mattered was the passport that was now in the hands of officials who were unsure of its legitimacy. The first officer returned after what felt like a long time, holding a phone in his hand. He stood in front of her, his expression unreadable, and without a word, he handed the phone over to another officer who was waiting in the wings. The woman glanced at the phone nervously, but there was little she could do except comply. The officer's tone was businesslike as he spoke into the phone, his words muffled as he communicated with someone higher up the chain of command. "Could you please double-check the passport details?" the officer asked into the receiver. "This one doesn't match the usual standards we have on file. I'm not sure what we're dealing with here." His words were followed by a moment of silence, and she couldn't help but wonder what the person on the other end of the call was saying. The growing tension in the air seemed to reflect in the voices of the officers, whose earlier confident demeanor had now shifted to uncertainty. The woman's thoughts raced. She had never expected this kind of treatment, especially not after all the work she had done as a diplomat. The United Nations had sent her on numerous important missions, and she had been trusted to negotiate, represent, and facilitate crucial conversations between nations. Her work was respected, and her passport was a symbol of her authority and importance on the global stage. Yet here she was, being questioned by two officers who were treating her as though she had just stepped out of a fake passport scam. She had spent years earning the trust of the international community, and yet in this moment, none of that seemed to matter. The way the officers were handling her passport felt like a personal attack. She had no idea why this was happening, but it was clear that something wasn't right. They were making assumptions, and those assumptions were damaging. The seconds ticked by, and the officer on the phone continued to speak with whoever was on the other end, their conversation a blur of technical jargon. The woman's frustration began to build. She understood the need for security at an international airport, but this felt like an unnecessary overstep. It wasn't as though she was trying to hide anything. She had nothing to prove other than the fact that she was a professional doing her job. But to them, it seemed as if she was nothing more than a problem to be solved. Her patience was wearing thin, but she held her ground. She had faced challenges before, even as a woman in a world that often doubted her capabilities. But this felt different. This felt more personal, more frustrating than any obstacle she had ever encountered. She kept her focus on the officers, reminding herself that the truth was on her side. She had nothing to hide. After what seemed like an eternity, the officer on the phone ended the call. He looked at the woman with a forced, almost apologetic expression. "We need to take this up with higher authorities," he said, his voice colder than before. The woman could tell from the way he spoke that the situation was far from resolved. She had expected the worst, but this wasn't just a routine check anymore. It was quickly becoming something much more serious. The air around her seemed to grow heavier with each passing minute. The officers' movements became more deliberate, their eyes constantly flicking between the passport and their monitors. The woman stood there, feeling the sting of every moment that passed without resolution. It wasn't just the time lost or the frustration that built inside her. It was the growing sense of helplessness. Why was this happening? Why was her professional identity being questioned in such a way? She had been in difficult situations before, but never one like this. As a diplomat, she was used to scrutiny, but this was something else entirely. She had the highest level of credentials and was trusted by world leaders to negotiate on their behalf. Yet here she was, being treated like someone who had no right to even step foot in the airport, let alone represent her country at the United Nations. It felt like a sharp contradiction to everything she had worked for. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a door opening behind her. Another officer had entered the room, and this time he wasn't alone. He was accompanied by a supervisor, a man who looked as though he had spent years in his position. He scanned the room briefly before his gaze fixed on the woman. He had an authoritative presence, and his demeanor instantly put the woman on edge. "We've reviewed the situation, and we're going to take a closer look at this passport," the supervisor said, his voice firm. "Please come with us." The woman was stunned, unsure whether to protest or remain silent. But what could she say? She had been trying to explain herself from the moment she had arrived at the counter, but it felt as if her words were falling on deaf ears. Her patience was wearing thin, and the anxiety building inside her made it harder to stay composed. Still, she forced herself to stay calm and nodded. As she followed the officers through the narrow hallways of the airport, her mind raced. She thought of all the important work she had done for the United Nations, the countless meetings, and the impact she had made. None of that seemed to matter now. She was just another person being questioned by airport officials, caught in a web of misunderstanding and bureaucracy. They led her to a small, dimly lit room away from the main terminal. The door clicked shut behind her as they instructed her to sit. The supervisor began flipping through the pages of the passport again, his eyes narrowing with each scan. He muttered something under his breath, but the woman could barely make out his words. He was clearly not convinced. She was left to wait again, the seconds dragging by, each one adding to her growing frustration. The room felt stifling, and the fluorescent lights above her flickered slightly, adding to the tension in the air. The officer beside her continued to watch her, his eyes unblinking, as if trying to catch her in some sort of lie. It felt as though the world outside had disappeared, leaving her trapped in this moment of uncertainty. Her thoughts drifted to her family, to the people she had left behind to complete her mission. She wondered how they would react if they knew what was happening now. They would be just as confused as she was. She opened her mouth to speak, to ask for an explanation, but before she could say anything, the supervisor raised a hand to silence her. "We have to be sure. If this passport is a forgery, it could be a serious matter," he said bluntly, his tone leaving no room for argument. The woman's heart sank, and a cold chill ran down her spine. This wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. It had escalated far beyond what she had imagined. She was no longer just a diplomat trying to return home. She was now a suspect, and that thought weighed heavily on her. How had it come to this? The silence in the room felt suffocating, and with every passing moment, the weight of the situation seemed to grow heavier. The woman sat still, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, as she watched the officers continue their inspection of her passport. It was almost as if they were hoping to find something, anything, that would confirm their suspicions. She could feel their eyes on her, but she refused to let their doubt shake her. She knew who she was. She knew what she represented. But in this moment, it seemed as if none of that mattered. The supervisor had gone silent, his face unreadable as he flipped through her passport again. The woman's thoughts were racing. How had it come to this? She had traveled so many times before, and never once had she faced a situation like this. She had crossed borders, negotiated with foreign officials, and worked tirelessly to bridge gaps between nations. She was trusted. So why, now, was her entire career being questioned over a passport? Her mind drifted back to the countless hours she had spent preparing for her most recent mission. The briefings, the negotiations, the delicate balance of diplomacy that required every ounce of her focus. She had worked hard to gain the respect of her colleagues and to make a difference in the world. But now, in this small, sterile room, all of that seemed to have disappeared. She was just another person under suspicion, her passport just another document to be doubted. The silence was finally broken when one of the officers, who had been quietly observing her from across the room, spoke up. "Do you have any idea why this might be happening?" he asked. His tone was not accusatory, but it still felt heavy with the weight of his previous actions. The woman took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "I don't understand," she said, her voice calm but tinged with frustration. "This is my official diplomatic passport. I have been traveling with it for years, representing the United Nations. This is not a fake." The officer nodded, but his expression remained skeptical. "It doesn't look like the kind of passport we're used to seeing," he said slowly. "There are discrepancies. It's not that we don't trust you, but the system doesn't lie. We have to follow procedure." She knew what he was implying, that something wasn't right. The implication that her passport might be a forgery stung, even though she had expected something like this to happen from the moment she saw their skeptical glances. She had been trained to handle difficult situations, but this felt different. She was not only a representative of her country, but she was also a person, a woman who had worked her entire life to be taken seriously. She looked the officer in the eye and said again, with as much confidence as she could muster, "I am a diplomat. My mission was legitimate, and this passport is as real as my commitment to my work. Please check with the United Nations, verify my identity, whatever you need to do. I'm not trying to hide anything." The officer seemed to consider her words for a moment, but it wasn't enough to change his course of action. The woman was left to wait once again. Time felt like it was dragging, each minute stretching longer than the last. She could hear the distant sounds of the airport in the background, the hum of the baggage claim, the chatter of passengers, the faint announcements over the intercom. But it all felt distant, as if she were in a world apart from everything else. Then, just as she was starting to wonder how much longer she would be stuck in this limbo, the officer picked up the phone again. This time, he didn't look at her as he dialed. His focus was entirely on the call, and she couldn't help but wonder if he was going to verify her story or if they would continue to treat her like a suspect. Minutes ticked by slowly as the officer spoke in quiet, urgent tones to whoever was on the other end of the line. Her hands clenched again, frustration bubbling up, but she kept it in check. She had no choice but to trust that the truth would eventually come to light. She just hoped it wouldn't take much longer. The room was quiet, but the silence was thick with tension. The woman sat there, her eyes flickering between the officers and the door that had been closed behind her. She could hear muffled voices in the hallway, but she had no idea what they were saying. The hum of the fluorescent lights above her seemed louder than ever, as if mocking the stillness that surrounded her. She knew the officers were just doing their job, but in this moment, she couldn't help but feel like she was being treated as a criminal. Her patience, once steady, was now beginning to wear thin. She had spent years building her career, earning the trust of world leaders and her colleagues at the United Nations. She had worked tirelessly to represent her country and to bridge the gaps between nations. She had walked into rooms filled with some of the most powerful people on Earth, negotiating peace, handling delicate matters of diplomacy, and now she was here, sitting in a small, sterile room at an airport, waiting for officers to determine whether her passport was real or fake. The sound of the phone clicking as the officer ended the call brought her back to the present. The officer who had been speaking to someone on the other end of the line looked up at her. His expression had softened slightly, but there was still a hint of disbelief in his eyes. It was clear that the situation had taken an unexpected turn. The woman could feel her heart racing in her chest, but she kept her face neutral, her hands still resting on her lap. She had no choice but to remain composed. "We've checked with the United Nations," the officer said slowly, his voice a bit quieter now. "It seems you are who you say you are." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "Your passport is legitimate. I'm sorry for the confusion." The weight of his words hit her like a wave. For a moment, she felt as though she had been holding her breath, and now she could finally exhale. The frustration that had been building up inside her began to melt away, but a feeling of disbelief lingered. All of this had been unnecessary. She had known all along that her passport was real, yet they had doubted her, questioned her, and put her through an ordeal that no one should have to experience. She looked up at the officer, her voice calm but firm. "Thank you for verifying my identity, but I want to understand how this happened. How could there have been such a mistake? Why did you treat me like this?" Her words weren't accusatory. She was simply seeking answers. She needed to know how this misunderstanding had spiraled so far out of control. The officer hesitated for a moment before responding. "It's our responsibility to be cautious," he said. "We don't take chances with things like this. Your passport had certain features that didn't match what we have on record. Our system flagged it, and that's why we needed to investigate further." The woman nodded, taking in his explanation. She understood the importance of security, especially in a world where international borders and identities were often the subject of scrutiny. But there was something about the way it had unfolded that didn't sit right with her. She had been caught in the crossfire of a system that was designed to protect, but had ended up doubting her credibility. "So, what happens now?" she asked, her voice steady despite the lingering frustration. The officer looked at her, a hint of regret in his eyes. "We're going to clear everything up and make sure this doesn't happen again," he said, his tone apologetic. "You're free to go. I'm sorry for the inconvenience." For a moment, the woman simply stared at him. Her passport, the very thing that had been the source of all this trouble, was now in her hands again. The officers had gone from questioning its legitimacy to apologizing for the inconvenience. It was all over, but the feeling of disbelief didn't fade immediately. She had been questioned, humiliated, and put through a process that, in hindsight, seemed so unnecessary. She stood up slowly, her body still feeling tense, though she was relieved that it was finally over. "Thank you," she said simply. Her voice was calm, but the weight of the experience would stay with her for a long time. She couldn't shake the thought that, despite everything, this had been a reflection of something much larger, a system that had failed to recognize her for who she truly was until the very last moment. As she walked out of the small room, the woman couldn't help but reflect on what had just happened. She was a diplomat, someone who had spent her career working to build bridges between nations. But in that moment, it felt like all of that had been disregarded. It was a harsh reminder that sometimes, no matter what we achieve or how hard we work, we can still find ourselves judged by things that have nothing to do with our abilities. As the woman walked out of the small, dimly lit room, the weight of the entire experience seemed to lift slightly with each step she took. The officers had cleared up the confusion, and though the ordeal was over, the sense of discomfort lingered. She felt as if she had just been through a whirlwind, the tension, uncertainty, and frustration of the past few hours still fresh in her mind. The sound of her footsteps echoed in the quiet hallway as she made her way back to the main part of the airport, but it was as if the world had shifted slightly in her eyes. She had been cleared, her identity verified, but the damage had already been done. The humiliation, the questioning, the cutting of her passport. Those moments couldn't be erased so easily. In the back of her mind, she knew that this wasn't just about her or her passport anymore. It was about something deeper, something more troubling. It was about the assumptions people made based on appearances, on race, on status. She had been treated with suspicion, even though she was who she said she was, even though she had every right to be there. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself as she approached the exit of the security area. There was a small part of her that wanted to turn back, to confront the officers again and ask them how they could have treated her this way. But another part of her knew that the situation was beyond that now. They had apologized, and they had acknowledged their mistake. But the hurt still lingered. As she walked through the terminal, the hustle and bustle of the airport seemed almost surreal. People rushed by, going about their business, unaware of what had just happened. She watched families reunite, friends greeting each other with smiles, travelers eagerly checking in for their flights. But none of it felt real to her. The normality of the airport seemed disconnected from her own experience. It was as if the world had continued on while she had been stuck in a moment of doubt and uncertainty. She couldn't help but replay the situation over and over in her mind. How had it all gotten to this point? She had tried to explain herself from the start, but they hadn't listened. They had doubted her based on a piece of paper. Her passport, a simple document that had represented years of hard work and dedication, had been questioned like it was nothing more than a forgery. She thought about how many others, who might not have had the same resources or the same opportunity to explain themselves, would have been caught in the same situation. How many people had faced this kind of treatment, only to be ignored, dismissed, or worse? She shook her head, trying to push the thoughts aside. There was no point in dwelling on what couldn't be changed. The officers had apologized, and the situation was over. But the experience would stay with her for a long time. It was a painful reminder of the biases that still existed, even in places where you should expect to be treated with respect and fairness. She reached the main lobby and paused for a moment, taking in the scene around her. It felt like the first time she had truly seen it all in perspective. The reality of how she had been treated, how she had been made to feel so small, was still sinking in. But in that moment, she also realized something else. This wasn't the end of her story. It was just one chapter. And despite everything, she would keep going. She had spent years working hard, and one mistake from a few officers wouldn't define her. She was more than that. Her work, her dedication, and her commitment to her mission would always be what defined her. That, she knew, was something no one could take away. As she walked toward the exit, she straightened her back, standing taller than she had before. She had been questioned, tested, and doubted, but she was still standing. And that, more than anything else, was a testament to who she truly was. As the woman made her way through the bustling airport, her mind was still processing everything that had just happened. The incident at the customs counter, the questioning, the long hours spent waiting for her identity to be verified. It all felt surreal. Her passport, which had been an unquestioned tool of her work for years, had suddenly been reduced to something suspect, something that could not be trusted. It wasn't just about the document anymore. It was about how she had been seen, how the officers had judged her simply by her appearance, by assumptions that had nothing to do with who she was or what she represented. As she moved past the crowds, the echoes of the moment still clung to her, but a strange sense of clarity began to take root. The truth had finally come to light. She had been cleared. But there was something bigger at play here, something that went beyond a single airport incident. It was the realization that, in many ways, she was a symbol for the systems of prejudice and bias that continued to affect so many people, especially those who didn't fit the mold of what others expected. She couldn't help but think about how easy it was for others to make assumptions based on superficial factors. A passport was meant to serve as a key to the world, a representation of identity. Yet here she was, standing in an airport trying to prove her legitimacy. In that moment, she felt the weight of all the people who had ever been questioned or doubted in the same way. Those whose identities had been invalidated because of their appearance, background, or status. It wasn't just about one person's experience. It was about the system as a whole. But despite the frustration, she realized that there was power in her own story. She could have let this moment define her, let the officer's doubt cast a shadow over everything she had worked for, but she wouldn't. She knew that what mattered most was her own belief in herself, her work, and her purpose. She wasn't going to let this setback derail her. She had faced worse challenges in her life, and each time, she had come out stronger. Her role as a diplomat was not just about representing her country at a table of negotiators. It was about challenging assumptions, breaking barriers, and showing the world that human dignity was not determined by a passport, a title, or the color of one's skin. It was about resilience and the willingness to keep going, even when the world seemed to push back. She had always understood that her position came with its own set of challenges, but this experience had shown her something deeper, how important it was for people to be treated with respect and fairness, regardless of their status. She had always known the power of diplomacy, but this had given her a clearer understanding of the work that still needed to be done, both within herself and in the world at large. As she reached the exit and stepped out into the fresh air, a sense of relief washed over her. It was over. She had been questioned, but she had stood firm. She had faced the uncertainty with grace, and she had come out the other side with her integrity intact. It wasn't just a victory for her. It was a reminder of the larger battles people faced every day. Battles against prejudice, assumptions, and biases that were often invisible but ever present. For a moment, she simply stood there, taking in the sight of the world moving on around her. The cars, the people, the life that continued without a second thought about what she had just been through. And yet she knew that what she had just experienced was not isolated. It was a small piece of a much larger puzzle, one that required awareness, understanding, and change. But for now, she had done what she could. She had been true to herself, and that was enough. As she walked toward her next destination, her steps were a little lighter, her resolve a little stronger. This experience would stay with her, but it would not define her. She was more than a moment, more than an airport incident. She was a woman with a purpose, and that purpose would continue to guide her forward.